spiritual food for thought.
Welcome back to Spiritual Food for Thought. I thank you for joining me once again. In this video, I'm going to cover the problem with the Ten Commandments. And there's actually two problems I'm going to point out here. The second one's going to be even more important, so I hope that you'll stay tuned for that. But I want to touch on this other one first. And basically, here's an example of what people generally put up for the Ten Commandments. And it's amazing because these are put up a lot of courthouses, a lot of city halls, a lot of public display of them. And there's a lot of atheists and people who claim not to believe that there's a God who don't want these things sitting around in public. And I understand that that's like a testimony against them, so they wouldn't want to see it because it's hard to pretend that God doesn't exist, or harder to pretend that God doesn't exist when you have reminders constantly in your face. But the interesting thing is for the vast majority of modern Christianity, this is actually like a condemnation against them too. Because while they want it up in public, the fourth, the Sabbath, the vast majority of modern Christians want nothing to do with. They reject it. They say, Jesus is my Sabbath rest. They say, Sunday's replaced it. They come up with all these other things, but I wouldn't necessarily want a condemnation against me on public display. So it's kind of interesting. That's one of the problems, is that even though it testifies against them, people want it up in public. That's a problem. That's interesting. That doesn't make much sense. But here's the deal. If you look at a display of the Ten Commandments like this is what I would consider not a very good display. Now, it's better than some, but it's not a very good display. Why would I say that? Well, the fourth commandment says, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. We're told in Scripture not to add or take away from his words. We're told not to do that. And yet what we find is people often take away from his words. And when displaying the Ten Commandments, they love to take the Sabbath and just shrink it down to remember the Sabbath day. Now, when it's actually written in Scripture, each time it shows up in Exodus chapter 20 and in Deuteronomy 5, it's like 4 verses each time it shows up. You have 4 words being given to things like murder, thou shalt not kill. 4 words given to things like stealing, thou shalt not steal. And you have 4 verses given to the Sabbath. And people take away of the emphasis that God puts on it. And in man's eyes, of the Ten Commandments, this would be like the least of the Ten Commandments. But it's very, very interesting that God puts the greatest emphasis on it. I have a video it's worth checking out on that subject, so I won't get into it here. But the interesting thing to think about too is if you look at like the Ten Commandments in Deuteronomy 5, you have 352 words total. From, have no other gods before me, to coveting. You have 352 words over 15 verses. Well, 133 of those words, and this is just English King James Version, but I'm using this as an example, 4 verses is actually the Sabbath. So that's 37.78%. That's almost 40% of the written out Ten Commandments is the Sabbath. If we look to Exodus 20, we have 297 words total, 15 verses, from have no other gods before me to coveting. And of that, 94 of the words, or 4 verses, are on the Sabbath. That's over 30%. That's 31.65% of the passage is the Sabbath. So if you add them together, both Deuteronomy and Exodus, the Ten Commandments from each time it's recorded, that's approximately 35% of the time, on average, is the Sabbath. 35% of the Ten Commandments, based on the amount of focus given to it, is the Sabbath. And the problem is, like I said, at least here people still say, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. But by taking away and turning it to remember the Sabbath day, eventually you get some that says work 6 days, rest 1, or keep a day holy. And by the time you get to keep a day holy, do you know what you've done? You've forgotten the Sabbath day. It is a specific day. It is the 7th day. It is the day that is to be remembered. Not the first day, not any given day of the week, Not just work 6, rest 1. If your company has Mondays off, then, work your 6 days and take Monday off. That's not what it says. It is remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. So let's back up to Genesis. In Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 and 3, it says, "And on the 7th day, God ended his work which he had made, and he rested on the 7th day from all his work which he had made. And God blessed the 7th day." He blessed the 7th day and sanctified it. So he sanctified and blessed the 7th day. Not any given day, not the first day, the 7th day. Because in it, he rested from all his work which God created and made. So it is the 7th day that is the Sabbath. It is that 7th day that he blessed and he sanctified and he set apart. It is the 7th day, the Sabbath, that we are supposed to be remembering. That's, one of the 10 Commandments. One of the 10 Commandments. Remember the Sabbath. Not remember any day, not remember the day Christ rose. It's remember the Sabbath day. And I find it sad that, he says don't add or take away. And I know it's easier to display less text. But again, normally, that much would be the Sabbath. And you'd have about a third, being the Sabbath. And then 2/3 being the rest of it. It changes things. If what people saw was not work 6, rest 1, or remember a day, if what they saw was remember the Sabbath day, and they saw it in its entirety, a different picture would be painted. And I know that some people are going to be like, oh, well, it's just so long, so we should shrink it down. You're saying, by using that excuse, that it's not worth our time or effort to consider what God actually says. Oh, God said to do some stuff, but it's not really worth our time and effort. Yeah, he made us, and even though we rebelled against him, he loved us while we were his enemies, and he sent his son to be our Messiah, to die as our substitute. But, it's just so much effort to have all those extra words, to focus more time and energy on seeing what God actually says and actually obeying him as a way to say thank you for all he's done to us. Personally, that is not the message that I want to send God with my lifestyle. It's simply not. So to end this video, I'm going to actually read the Sabbath in its entirety from each time it shows up in the 10 Commandments, starting with Exodus chapter 20, verse 8. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Remember, it was the 7th day that God blessed and sanctified back in Genesis 2. That's this one. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days thou shalt labor and do all thy work. But the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. Not the Sabbath of the Jews, the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, nor thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heaven and the earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested the 7th day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. In similar fashion, with much emphasis put on it by the amount of text that is given to it, we read this from Deuteronomy chapter 5, starting in verse 12. Keep the Sabbath day to sanctify it, as the Lord thy God hath commanded thee. 6 days thou shalt labor and do all thy work, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, nor thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thine ox, nor thy ass, nor any of thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates, that thy manservant and thy maidservant may rest as well as thou. And remember that thou wast a servant in the land of Egypt, and that the Lord thy God brought thee out thence through a mighty hand and by a stretched out arm. Therefore the Lord thy God commanded thee to keep the Sabbath day. If you notice, in each of those times I read that, in its entirety, did you see that just like in Genesis 2, it points each time to the 7th day and calls that the Sabbath? If you really wanted to have a debate about the 10 Commandments and whether it was the Sabbath or the first day of the week, if you actually read the text, It says it's the seventh day of the week. That is the Sabbath. That is one of the 10 commandments. So the second problem with the 10 commandments is people don't even care what it actually says. They don't care that it says the seventh day. They don't care that it's like a third of the 10 commandments based on emphasis and the amount of text given to that commandment. They want to shrink it down. They want to diminish what God has emphasized. They want to get it to the point where it says, remember the Sabbath, or here, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. And then they want to get it to the point where it says, work 6 days, rest one, or keep a day holy. By the time they do that, they've forgotten the Sabbath, and once it's removed, remember, back even in early America, okay, they took Sunday way more seriously than people do these days. But it's not the Sabbath, so it's so much easier after a couple generations for them not to care at all. I think the only thing you really can't do on Sunday now is buy liquor in a lot of places. I mean, think of that. God says don't work or cause anyone else to work on the seventh day. So we personally don't. And on Sunday, you can do anything except for go to the local store and buy alcohol. Is that what it's really about? Anyway, let me know in the comment section below your thoughts on this. Am I right? Are these two problems? And of course, the second one is the one I wanted to put the bigger emphasis on. The first one's a little easier to get away with, kind of once you shrink it down and diminish it or even change it to the point that it no longer even is remembering the Sabbath, remembering the seventh day, but they change it just to like remembering a day, observing a day, working 6 days, kind of sort of maybe resting for brunch on one. That is a problem. But the bigger problem is that people do not actually care what God says. He gives you every second of every day for your entire life. Feel free to read 4 verses. Feel free to take the time out of your life to read all 4 verses pertaining to the seventh day, the Sabbath, if you actually want to consider what God commands in the 10 commandments. In Psalm 1 it says, blessed is the man who meditates on God's law day and night. Now there's a lot more to his law, but I would recommend at least starting easy. The entry-level course, the remedial course, and meditating on the 10 commandments day and night. I'll see you next time. Be blessed. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.